Okay, so welcome everybody to one of our department's bags. First of all, I'm just going to make a simple announcement that now has to precede every event that we organize, which is simply to say that speakers' remarks are based on their own scholarship and experience, and so none of us or none of the speakers speak for Harvard. So that's just a general statement, a disclaimer. But I'm delighted to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Abdulrahim, who is a professor of public health at the University of the American University in Beirut, but is visiting, fortunately, with us at the FXB Center as our first inaugural Palestine program for Health and Human Rights Fellow. Dr. Abdulrahim has worked for many years on issues to do with a whole range of areas where public health and human rights intersect. You'll see that she kind of has a broad lens of how she approaches these topics. She got her doctoral degree from the School of Public Health in Michigan and Ann Arbor. And she has worked for many years on human rights issues, particularly in the Arab world, also looking at issues related to refugees and other vulnerable populations, labor migrants in the Arab region and beyond. Today, she's going to present some work that she did some time ago, I think, but data she collected on early marriage amongst adolescent girls in situations of displacement. I think this work is based on, again, on the Middle East, but anyway, very much looking forward to hearing about these trajectories of risk. So Sawsan, thank you very much for joining us today. And I know this is a work in progress, and that's exactly what these seminars are designed for. So there's give and take and scholarly kind of collegial criticism. So that's, we're delighted to hear from you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Baba, and I'm delighted to be here and present on this work on early marriage among adolescent refugee girls in Lebanon. I've been working on this, as you will see a few minutes later. I've been working in the area of early marriage and displacement and adolescent sexual and reproductive health for a number of years. And I was just telling Dr. Baba that it has been a nice distraction for me to go back to thinking about early marriage and displacement, even though it's also a heavy topic, than to think about the political context that we are living in right now. I just want to show this. This is from the most recent data by UNICEF, showing changes in the rates of marriage, women marrying before age 18 in different world regions. And as you see, the Middle East and North Africa is somewhere in the middle, and is actually comparable or even doing a little bit better than the world average in terms of the rate of girls younger than age 18 marrying. And actually, the rate has increased tremendously in the region in the 1980s and 1990s, but it has kind of almost stagnated in the past couple of decades in terms of further reductions in the rate of marriages of girls younger than 18 years of age. In some countries in the region, such as Egypt, which has one of the highest rates of marriage, girls marrying before age 18, the rate is 17%. And as you see, the curve here is, the slope is very low, and there has been stagnation since 2009. In Iraq, a country that has been mired in conflict for over decades, you see that the rate has actually increased. The blue line in both countries here is marriage below age 18, and the red line at the bottom is marriage before age 15. So very, very young marriage. The best way of calculating the prevalence or the rate of early marriage is to actually look at women who are 20 to 24 years of age and ask them about their age of marriage. So that's the most accurate estimate of early marriage in any country. And that's what the rate that is used to compare countries and to compare time periods. In Lebanon, which is where I work and where the study that I'm going to talk about today took place, early marriage in Lebanon actually is, or marriage before age 18, is relatively low, is one of the lowest in the region. So only 6% of women have married below age 18. And in fact, this is mostly concentrated in certain pockets, rural areas, poverty areas. It is rare in let's say an urban center like the capital city of Beirut for girls to marry before age 18. Among Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, the rate is higher, is double. So 12% of Palestinian women have married below age 18. And among Syrian refugees, the rate is very high. It's extremely high and is alarming. This is data from a study conducted or survey conducted by UNICEF in 2017 that included Lebanese, Palestinian refugees, and Lebanese citizens, Palestinian refugees, and Syrian refugees using the same methodology. Since 2011, after the beginning of the civil war or crisis or civil conflict that took place in Syria, large numbers of Syrians were displaced in Lebanon. At some point, there was maybe around 2015, 2016, the numbers were 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And Lebanon has a population of 6 million. So that's a very high proportion of the population that was refugee. The number of refugees has gone down because for various reasons, United Nations stopped registering refugees. So the official numbers have gone down. But also some Syrians want to return to Syria. Some Syrians traveled to Europe through smuggling routes and to other parts of the world. So the number of Syrian refugees in Lebanon registered right now is around 800,000, not 1 million. This is a population that is extremely disadvantaged. A large proportion of them live in rural areas in what are called informal tented settlements. They are like refugee camps, but they are not acknowledged by the Lebanese government. So they're called informal tented settlements, meaning that the Lebanese government does not take on any responsibility towards providing them with any electricity, water, and other infrastructural waste management, other infrastructural services. The United Nations and the international community basically provide all these services to them. This is really important, important context to understand about the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, because they're in fact, they are not representative of the Syrian population. They are, for the most part, they come from rural areas. They have been disadvantaged and dislocated in Syria before they even became geographically displaced in Lebanon. And so the rates of marriage before age 18 are much higher than the average rate in Syria. And the socioeconomic position of groups that have become refugees in Lebanon and have stayed as refugees, protracted refugees in Lebanon, is absolutely not representative of Syrian population. Okay. So for a number of years, early marriage, and I want to highlight that I use the term early marriage and not child marriage for political reasons, because child marriage is a buzzword or a term that is used heavily by international humanitarian organizations in a manner that sensationalizes the practice. And as you see in many of the publications by international organizations, it is referred to as child/forced marriage rather than early marriage. And it's in the SDGs, it's referred to as a harmful cultural practice like female genital cutting, and other gendered practices in different parts of the world. Again, globally, but specifically by humanitarian organizations in Lebanon, there's a very heavy push to criminalize marriages below age 18, referring to it as a human rights violation, gender-based violence. There are these associations that are drawn, or causal associations, that early marriage is what keeps girls out of school and what leads to poor maternal and child health outcomes and domestic violence, disempowerment in marital relationships. And in general, it's seen as a practice that is impeding development in a large number of countries in the global south. I want to make sure that people understand that I'm not saying that I'm for marriage, women marrying or girls marrying before age 18. I'm just very critical of the sensationalizing discourse that international humanitarian organizations use to refer to marriages below age 18 that for the most part take place in impoverished and very marginalized communities. In control of this. Okay. So my argument is that the insistence in referring to marriage before age 18 as child or forced marriage and the exclusive focus on its harmful effects obscures the complexity of the obscures our understanding of the structural drivers of early marriage, particularly in humanitarian contexts, and basically does not allow us to understand how decisions about marriage take place in many cases by the young adolescents themselves, either with the participation of their families or by the family, by the adults in the family alone, without the participation of the adolescents. And the purpose of early marriage, if you speak to any Syrian refugee in Lebanon, they would evoke the concept of security and safety, that this is a practice that ensures the security and safety of adolescent girls, particularly those who have very limited options. From my point of view, that if we want to address early marriage and put in place policies that would reduce its prevalence further, we really need to understand early marriage more clearly. And we need to understand why populations or social groups where early marriage is prevalent, what positive outcomes do they see coming out of early marriage? Even if from our positionality, we see that these positive outcomes are short-term, and in the long term, they're actually against the well-being of girls and women. So for policies to find alternatives to early marriage, we really need to understand what early marriage means or what the function of early marriages are in the context of forced displacement. And that's how I've actually grown in my way of thinking about early marriage tremendously in the past few years since I started to work in this area. And I started in 2016, in fact, 8 years ago, with a small study. All my work has been with colleagues, actually, in research groups. In 2016, we conducted a survey in 3 towns in the Bekaa region in Lebanon. The Bekaa region is the eastern governorate in Lebanon that borders Syria. So a lot of Syrian refugees who became displaced settled in the Bekaa. And the main reason why they settled in Bekaa is because this is the agricultural area in Lebanon. It's the breadbasket of Lebanon. So, and historically, Syrians have been seasonal migrant workers in Lebanon. They worked in agriculture during the summer, but then they went back and lived in Syria for the rest of the year. With the war, the conflict, when they became displaced as refugees, they did not go back to Syria. They, in fact, stayed. And the agricultural economy in Lebanon transformed because of that reality, that Syrian migrant workers, agricultural workers, were not moving back and forth. They actually settled in Lebanon. So in 2016, we conducted a survey in 3 towns in the Bekaa, rural areas, agricultural areas. And what we found was that almost 1 out of 4 girls between the ages of 15 and 17 was married during that time. So, and this is, again, this is not the actual estimate of early marriage. This is just saying that girls below age 17, 1 out of every 4 was already married before age 17. And a large proportion of them were already pregnant or had children. I did put here age 15 to 17 because there were only a couple of 14-year-olds who were married. So, with respect to school education, and this survey was done in 2016, 2 to 3 years after a system was already set in place for Syrian refugees children to attend public schools in Lebanon, with the cost being paid by the United Nations refugee, UNHCR and UNICEF. Okay. So half of the 9 to 17-year-old girls who were supposed to be in school, half of them were not in school, were not enrolled, and only 1/3, less than a third, were enrolled in formal school. If you look at this by, by increasing age, almost 90% of the 17-year-olds were not in either formal or informal. So that was the first study, and I personally was skeptical of the very high rates of early marriage that were being put out in different reports. But then this survey, and we tried very hard actually, we worked really diligently to create a sampling frame and to spend a good amount of time working on the methodology in order to really get an accurate estimate of early marriage at that time. And we found out that the rate was very high. Okay. Then my second phase of working on early marriage, the longest phase actually, was an intervention study. Again, this is in collaboration with colleagues. But I was the principal investigator of this study. First, in 2018, we conducted a pilot intervention in a community with girls who were already enrolled in school. They had not dropped out of school. And then after the pilot, we started the actual intervention in 2020. But then because of COVID, actually there was a long disruption, and then we went back and we stopped and we went back. And then we completed this in the actual intervention in 2023. The intervention is called Amina, which in Arabic means, it's a name of a girl, and it means safe or secure. Because in our formative research, the concept of girls' safety and security was always evoked in the context of why girls are married at a young age. And the aim of this intervention was to mitigate the drivers of early marriage among Syrian refugee adolescent girls through enhancing their access to sexual and reproductive health information and services. So it was a traditional intervention in that it really relayed knowledge about sexual reproductive health to adolescent refugees. It worked with the mothers as well. And there was a lot of effort to change norms and attitudes towards early marriage and girls and gender attitudes and attitudes towards marriage, early marriage. Okay. Then the third study, which I will talk about the most today, was a life history study that was conducted in 2022 and 2023. And life history interviewing is a qualitative method of interviewing, whereby participants are asked to narrate their life story, basically from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. And to provide the researcher with an account of their life based on their own understanding. And sometimes, in fact, there's a little bit of fiction that goes into the life story. And the participant, in fact, decides what to focus on and what not to focus on. So we were asking, when we did these interviews, we would ask, what would you like to speak about first? What phase of your life? What would you like? What are things that were happy in your life that you want to talk about? Are there other things that you'd like to talk about, or do you not want to mention things that were sad phases of your life, or things that were negative in your life? So the participants tend to be selective and mention events basically that they remember the most and that they mean the most to them. I want to acknowledge that I conducted a few of these life history interviews, but I was working with an excellent research assistant, Miriam Dalit, who took on and completed these interviews. The purpose of this life history study is basically to understand the complexity of the drivers of early marriage from the participants themselves, rather than through research where we come with our own understandings and of early marriage. Of course, this was very much carried out in the context of a humanitarian crisis. So the war, displacement, the living conditions in Lebanon were a very important part of these interviews. And we were really interested in how the decision about marriage took place, how the marriage took place. In some cases, really talking about decision or choice or a process didn't really fit very much with how marriage took place, and why people considered it, why they thought it was a good idea for the adolescent and for her parents, her family members, her community in many cases, to basically be convinced and to convince the adolescent to marry. We're interested very much in trajectories, girls who at a very early age are put on a trajectory where, there would be a very high probability that they would get married early, versus girls who would, be put on a trajectory of low risk of early marriage, but then something happens and they get married. We were interested in events. The main events were the war, displacement, but also puberty. We asked about puberty, when the girl reached puberty, what her life during that phase of development was, and then the choices and the decision-making process. So the study was really to try to understand trajectories, events, and the decision-making process. This is just an example of life history interviewing. Also comes with what's called life history maps. And this is a very rough example of a life history map where the person we interviewed was born in 2000 and the interview was in 2022. I failed to mention that all of interviews were done with adult women, so with women 20 to 25 years of age who married before age 18. We did not interview any adolescents because we didn't, mainly because, conceptually, because we wanted women to reflect back and to analyze their lives as they were being interviewed. But also we, at my institution, it's extremely difficult to get IRB approval to do interviews with adolescents, particularly refugees. So this is just a life history map of one participant who was born in 2000, and the interview was done in 2022. So when, basically there's a long period where there's very little events taking place. She was in school, but then she left school. This is 2011, the breakout of the war in Syria. She reached puberty between 2011 and 2014. She started to work in agriculture during that period of time, and despite the war. Then she moved to Lebanon in 2014. She got married in 2016, so she was 16 years old. This was an unfortunate situation. Her husband actually died, passed passed away in 2020, so 4 years after the marriage, and the interview was conducted in 2022. So we tried, we put these maps, linear chronological maps, and we tried to get as much information on the different years and different phases of the life of the participant. So we conducted 20 interviews. These were in-depth interviews that lasted 2 to 3 hours each. We conducted these interviews with 20 young Syrian refugee women, 20 to 25 years of age, all of whom married before age 18. We also conducted interviews with 10 mothers of the participants. The 10 who agreed to participate, because we wanted to also get a sense of how the marriage took place from the point of view of a parent, and not only from the point of view of the adolescent. In some interviews, we found some contradiction between what the mothers and the woman we interviewed said about how marriage took place. So we worked hard to recruit women who married below age 15. So very early, very young marriages. We were able to recruit 8, but mostly a larger number were women who married between age 15 and 17. This is, again, a very socioeconomically disadvantaged population. So 14 out of the 20 live in an informal tented settlement in a refugee camp, and 6 live in apartments. And in many cases, they are very dilapidated apartments that don't have services. They don't have paint. And in the interviews, we were really concerned with understanding the complexity of how the lives of women who married early through their life history transitions. So we asked, and this was, we probed to try to understand basically the childhood, the adolescence, puberty, but in some cases, participants didn't want to talk about one phase of her life as much. So we have some gaps in the data, but we tried as much as possible to go through childhood, early childhood, puberty, school and school dropout, when the girl left school, when her experience during displacement, and then marriage, of course, was the core central element we asked about, and then also about childbearing. Just very quickly, the majority, of course, this is a qualitative interview, and this is not probability sampling or anything, but the majority of the participants had dropped out of school years before they married. So, and I have always suspected this, that there are structural factors that lead girls to drop out of school and to get married. It's not that marriage leads girls to drop out of school. So, okay, so this is maybe the best part of the work, is really to read the data and to understand basically the experiences of these married early. I selected 2, and these are pseudonyms, Sidra and Sham. These are very common girl names in the Syrian community. I selected these 2 participants because they have experiences that are almost surreal. They both married very early, one at age 13 and one at age 12. They both married twice. The first marriage that worked out, then they married again. They married after they dropped out of school. One of them, Sidra, after she became displaced in Lebanon, whereas Sham before displacement. In both cases, the father was absent from the lives of the girls. And again, that's another thing to address, because there's in the humanitarian approach to early marriage, there's always this idea that the father forces the girl to get married. And in some cases, the absence of the father is what forces the girl to get married early. The mother was very much present in the lives of these girls, and she was a very important part of the decision making. But again, I have a very critical view about how, whether mother's decision making is a form of agency or a form of, basically decision made because there are no other options, no other alternatives that the mother could do to support her daughter. So let me start by Sidra. We have until 2, right, for this?
Yeah.
So
But we'd like to keep some time for Q&A.
yeah, I'll just spend
No, that's fine.
5-10 minutes on this. So Sidra, the first girl, okay, so I will just keep this here. But Sidra, her childhood in Syria, she grew up in a rural, poor family, headed by her mother. On more than one occasion during the interview, Sidra made it clear that her father was absent from her life and that she lived in a matriarchal household where the mother was the one who put food on the table. The mother was the one who gave the children money to go on trips. The mother is the one who made the decision to leave Syria after war broke out. And it was the mother basically who convinced the mother, but also the community convinced Sidra to get married the first time she received the marriage proposal. The father was not dead, but he was just absent from the lives of his children and wife. So Sidra left school years before she got married and before the war broke out in Syria. Although she liked school and had dreamt about becoming a teacher one day, she left school because she needed to help her mother, who was working in agriculture. This was in Syria, not in Lebanon. So the mother was working in agriculture in Syria and was toiling in the field from dawn to dusk. And she basically was making a decision first to get her oldest daughter out of school to help her. And then Sidra was the second oldest. So Sidra was taken out of school to help the mother work in the field. So Sidra actually started to work in agriculture before she turned 10 years old. Then she reached menarche at age 11, and the war broke out then. And shortly after, at age 12, she and her mother and her siblings and her aunt, her mother's sister and family, moved together from Syria to Lebanon. They immediately became integrated into the agricultural economy in Lebanon. So they lived in an informal tented settlement where all of them started to work in agriculture. So then shortly after arriving to Lebanon, Sidra's older sister eloped with someone. And Sidra was the only one who was working with the mother and the aunt in farm work, which is highly exploitative in Lebanon and is basically managed by middlemen who are called shawish. The Arabic word is shawish. And the agriculture has increasingly over the years become heavily reliant on women and children. So whereas, let's say 20 years ago, Syrian men would be seasonal migrant workers in Lebanon, it is very difficult for a man to find a job in agriculture now, a Syrian man to find a job in agriculture because, women and children are more desirable because they're more vulnerable to exploitation. The work of China, an anthropologist, China Sajadian, actually, it's not research on early marriage. Sajadian is an anthropologist who spent 18 months living in a farm community in Lebanon, and has looked at the indebtedness, how Syrian families become indebted and they have to continue to work in agriculture in order to pay off their debt. And then they have to basically have the women and children to work in agriculture longer hours in order to pay off the debt. And basically the debt is for rent and food that they are provided by the shawish or the land. So, okay. So the Sidra describes working in agriculture as not only tiring, but humiliating. She spends a lot of time during the interview talking about how humiliating it was for her to work in agriculture. But she had to do it because she had to help her mother. She was always feeling bad for her mother. The mother also felt bad for Sidra and distraught by the fact that Sidra was also very thin and had a small body. And this is really important. She had a small body and not the body of a woman. This is really important because it has implications for marriage as well. So despite the fact that Sidra didn't look like she was ready for marriage physically, the mother started to think that it would be better for her to get married than to work in the field. So when the first man proposed, Sidra refused. However, the mother and the community, Sidra keeps talking about the community, neighbors, family, the community, convinced her to accept the marriage because even though she was not ready for marriage, but the person who proposed was well off, had a car and a job, and would take her to live in an apartment in Beirut, in the city, rather than to live in a refugee camp. So she accepted, and within a week, she found herself living with this man in an apartment in Beirut. Unfortunately, this marriage was violent. It continued for 2 years. The man she was living with was abusive and violent, and he isolated her from her family. So that was one of the most difficult things for her, was not to be close to her family. She tried to escape multiple times. Finally, she was able to escape with the help of Lebanese neighbors. Then she discovered that, in fact, her marriage was not legally officiated, that the person who officiated her marriage was not registered, and her marriage was not registered at all. So in this case, she didn't even need to get divorced. She returned to live with her mother in the refugee camp and then went back to working in the field. She worked in the field for a few years, and then another man proposed to her. He had 5 children from a previous marriage. She married him. The marriage is relatively a good marriage. They have financial problems, but he is a kind man and he is understanding, and he very much appreciates the fact that she is raising his 5 children from a previous marriage. She also had 2 children with him. So she no longer works in agriculture, but she's all day providing domestic work inside. So I turn now to the other participant. Her name is Sham. She also grew up in a household where the father and the mother worked in agriculture in Syria. She used to go to school, but then at a young age, at age 10, she had an electrocution accident that impacted her learning ability in school. So she started to forget. She started not to do well in school after this accident. And she was going to a poorly resourced school that nobody was paying attention to her. She started to fail. Her parents couldn't support her. She didn't have any older, she had older siblings who were in school, but they didn't support her. So she didn't perform well in school, so she had to leave school. She left school. And then the war broke out. And at that time, Sham reached menarche, but she's different from Sidra in that Sham's mother says that at age 12, Sham actually looked like a woman. So she reached menarche early and she looked like a woman and she was ready for marriage physically. What happened, and this is a surreal story, what happened is that ISIS fighters descended on the village or the area where this family lived. Before that, Sham's father was abducted and the family didn't know where he was. And then they heard that all the men who were abducted were killed. They didn't receive confirmation that he was killed, but they assumed that he was killed. And then ISIS, so he was abducted by the Syrian army. But then ISIS men descended on the village where this family was living. And point, Sidra's older brothers had left to Lebanon because their father was killed and they were afraid that they would be killed as well. So the war here had a really important impact on the life trajectory of this girl, the accident, but then the war. So at that time, stories about ISIS men raping young girls, abducting them, were circulating in rural areas in Syria. But in this case, the ISIS fighters came to the village and said that they want to marry young girls. It was not cases of rape, but they proposed, there were a group of them who proposed to girls in the village to marry them. And she was one of the girls who was proposed to because she looked like she was ready for marriage. She proposed to by like a 26-year-old ISIS fighter. Again, she refused at first, but the mother told her that, you know, we are leaving to go to Lebanon. Your older brothers are in Lebanon. We are leaving. And because you're a young unmarried woman, girl, there's a risk that you would be raped if you don't get married. So that's what that's basically what the mother argued. So then she got married. She got married within a short period of time, and she describes her first marriage as a love marriage. She actually fell in love with him. It was a very short marriage, 1 month. She fell in love with this man. He was very kind and gentle with her, breaking all the stereotypes about ISIS fighters. He was very kind with her. He was very patient. She describes the wedding night in detail, in fact. But then, because he was a fighter, he was killed a month after they got married. So she was struck with grief, and her family, parents-in-law, told her that she could come and stay with them, but she decided to leave, and she went to Lebanon to stay with her mother. In Lebanon, again, she started to work in agriculture with her mother. Then she moved to work in a factory, and for a few years, she said she doesn't want to get married. She just wants to focus on herself and not get married to anyone. But at age 16, under social pressure, not necessarily the mother's pressure, she accepted to marry someone. But this second marriage, this is the opposite of Sidra's situation, where the first marriage was terrible and the second marriage was relatively good. In the case of Sham, the first marriage was a love marriage. The second, at age 12, was a love marriage. And the second one was a marriage that she wasn't happy in. She didn't experience happiness with her second husband. She said that she doesn't love him, but she has to, that's her only choice. She has to live. She already has 3 children with him, and financially he's doing okay. So these are really dramatic stories about girls who get married at a very young age during war, girls who work in agriculture at a very young age. Not all the stories are like this. As you saw in the table I showed, the majority married after age 16, 17. They were arranged marriages. Many were arranged marriages, very traditional. But these 2 stories are really stark in terms of the very, very young age in which the girls married, and also the trajectories and the events in their lives that literally made marriage the only option or the best option for these girls for survival, even for survival. So I'm currently looking at some writings and pleasantly surprised that there are quite a few articles and some theoretical articles that are talking about early marriage as in a non-cessationalist manner, trying to understand the difference between early marriages and non-early marriages. One of the important scholarly outputs is this book on a feminist analysis of early or child marriage in India by Mary John. That is a really important contribution, but also other articles on early marriage through the lens of understanding it as an outcome of inequities, the political economy of marriage, trying to understand the marriage institution, trying to understand early marriage through understanding the marriage institution in general in patriarchal societies. So this article, relatively recent, basically poses that there are three pathways to, or three structural factors that lead to early marriage. The first is adaptation to maximize reproductive success, that populations that have low life expectancy and where people start to weather an age early in life, that early marriage and early fertility are desirable and not like an accident. They are basically communities coping with their context. And in fact, there's some work on the United States and teen pregnancy that evokes this idea that in some racialized communities, girls get pregnant early as a coping. Then there's the idea that it's intergenerational conflict, that girls themselves sometimes choose to get married because of conflict with their parental generation. And the one that I'm focusing on is basically the decision making decisions out of in a context of constrained choice, how these decisions are made. Yeah, so what I'm looking at right now, and I would like your help, I should have, this should have been taken more time out of the presentation, but really to think about early marriage through the political economy lens, and link it to agriculture. I've just recently started reading China Sajadian's work that is not on early marriage, but it's on the political economy of Syrian refugees working in agriculture in Lebanon. And the interviews that the life history interviews basically blow this up, because a lot of it is related to how Syrian refugees in displacement interact with the labor economy in Lebanon, particularly young women and even adolescent young girls. Child and women's labor is very important. So there's, there are feminist writings on the linkages between productive and reproductive labor, women's labor. So women go out of, productive labor to reproductive labor, and this is exactly what happens with the two participants here, is that they were working in agriculture, and then they left agriculture, and then the rest, basically the rest of their life would be spent in reproductive labor, in domestic labor at home. And there's a, basically a decision, is domestic labor better than agriculture in certain contexts? Another theme that I'm definitely working on is how patriarchy manifests in the presence of a patriarch or a father or a male figure, and in the absence, how patriarchy and decisions continue to be driven by patriarchal factors in the absence of a father or a patriarch, and basically how women make decisions, and the decisions that women have to make in this context. So I will end here. So I leave 10 minutes for Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was a wonderful talk, and I love the kind of the really interdisciplinary way in which you think about this. It's so inspiring. I wonder if I could just maybe start with the first question, which is that very often in research, the researcher determines the structure and the content of the instrument for collecting data. And very often, as you know, I'm a lawyer, very often as lawyers, we start with really hard questions, why did you have to leave your home? What type of torture were you subjected to? Who was killed in your family? So I was very struck by what you said about the methodology you use, where you leave it to the interviewee to choose what they want to talk about and what they don't want to talk about. It seems to go against the grain of so much of the kind of orthodoxy in our research, which is that we know what we need to find out. We know what's important to answer our research questions. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. And in particular, is there a downside to people not talking about the things that you might have wanted to hear about.
Yeah, so the methodology is really, the life history interviewing is really allowing the person to decide what they want to focus on. We would probe, absolutely. And in many cases, we would receive a response after probing. And in some cases, the participant would still resist. You know, this is a very difficult period of her life, and she doesn't want to talk about it, for example. She wants to forget about it. And in some cases, you know, for example, in one interview, the person wanted to talk about her wedding night, and that's not what we were interested in. But she kept on talking about it, and we have this data, whereas we don't have, you know, there's a gap in other parts of the interview. This is why we also tried to interview all mothers, but we were only able to have consent from 10 of them, and some were not in Lebanon. So, but yeah, so the positive of this methodology is that it's really it's putting the researcher and the participant on an equal, you know, it's really not equal, because the researcher has at the end has the funding, has the ability to publish, and you know, but it's really giving the participant an opportunity to decide what they want to talk about. The downside is that we look at the transcripts, and there are things that there are gaps, and I would have liked to know more about, this idea that marriage just happened in many of the interviews. I would have liked to know more about like the whole discussion, the whole debate, and what was going on in the family with the girl, with her mother before she got married. But we don't have rich data on this.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much. You didn't mention the possible role of religion. I was surprised. Maybe that explains the contrast between the Lebanese and the Syrians, or not? Or did you ask about it in the
religion?
Yeah.
Meaning different religions, or so the majority of the Syrians in Lebanon are Sunni Muslims. Yes, in Lebanon, Lebanon is the reason why early marriage. Well, different things are connected. Lebanon has looks a little bit. Lebanon and Tunisia look a little bit different than other countries in the Arab region. They have high life expectancy, low fertility, very low fertility, in fact. They have like a bimodal, not necessarily bimodal, they have a delayed age of marriage, but then a small proportion of early marriage. But I'm not sure that, yes, in Lebanon, there are fertility rates are higher among Muslims than Christians, but fertility rate in Lebanon in general is low. And part of it is, maybe part of the reason is delayed marriage. Whereas in Syria, early marriage probably contributes a lot to high fertility. I'm not sure what religion has to do with it. It's more maybe socioeconomic conditions, So the ability, for example, families that have the ability to keep their daughters in school, to give their daughters certain music lessons. I don't know, I'm just trying to be very extreme. Absolutely would have zero rates of early marriage, whereas in social groups where the girls start to work in agriculture at age 9 or age 10, then that is a trajectory towards early marriage, because girls want to get out of that, and their mothers want them to get out of that. Yeah. Yes. Or
okay. Thank you very much. This is very interesting. I was curious to know a little bit more about the role of the fathers, and whether you also try to interview fathers in addition to the mother. And it seems you choose 2 cases where the father was absent. Was curious about the other cases.
Yes. So yeah, that's a very good question. These are cases where the father was absent. We have other cases where the father was absent, but in general, the father is there. And the father, we didn't interview fathers, no. The father, in general, there are certain conversations or decisions that the father detaches in this cultural context the father is not very close to the daughter. The convincing and the work, the labor of marriage is done by the mother and women in the family. But absolutely, there are cases where the father is the one who makes the decision. And particularly in cases of marriage, like cousin marriages, because the father cannot, the community is very, the kinship ties are very strong, that if a cousin proposed to a girl and the person who proposed is the brother or cousin of the father of the girl, it is very difficult to refuse. Yeah, this is something that we're looking at. I mean, this is the difference between Syria and Lebanon. So Syria, there are a lot of cousin marriages. Kinship is very important in marriage. Whereas in Lebanon, at least in urban context, that's not even a factor. But yes, there are cases where the decision is made by the father, but the labor and the convincing and the preparation is done by the mother, not the father.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. This was such a fantastic talk and fantastic project, and I really appreciate the opportunity to learn about it. Lots of questions, but the big one I had was, you spoke a little bit about Amina, but I'm wondering if there were any other interventions that you ran into that were successful in this field, and whether those interventions targeted early marriage head on, or did they try to alleviate some of the underlying factors? So for example, like, were there educational campaigns about, the detriments of child marriage and they're trying to prevent it? And then two, did these interventions run into any cultural barriers? For example, coming into the community and, the chief was saying, we don't want you coming in here, and we actually like the way our marriage system works, etc. If you don't mind elaborating a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I mean, just to answer the last part, yes, absolutely. There is resistance because people see in their community that safety and security of girls is really important. And in the context of Lebanon, there's relatively more safety, as in militant groups raping girls, or these are stories that were circulating in Syria. Again, these are stories. I don't know to what extent these things were happening. But in Lebanon, it's more, there's sexual harassment, there's girls' mobility is constrained. So refugee girls' mobility is very much constrained because the parents are very afraid of both for legal, because they don't have legal documentation, or because of sexual harassment. But with respect to programs, yes, there are a lot of programs. There are programs that are conducted by humanitarian organizations in Lebanon that focus a lot on relaying knowledge, and that early marriage is bad. I'm not sure how effective these are. There are also interventions in other parts of the world. And a recent systematic review of interventions in other parts of the world focused on, basically, the evidence shows that cash transfer is the only thing that works. Basically, it's, but that's government policy. It's not like as researchers, we couldn't give cash transfer to families, but giving a family in poverty a cash transfer to keep their daughter in school is the only thing that delays marriage. Now, the issue is that some evidence shows that then girls marry immediately after the cash transfer stops. And in the work by Mary John on India and early marriage, she critiques this focus on early marriage as the only bad thing. Their argument is that there is a problem with marriage in certain contexts, and whether it's early marriage or after, before 18 or after 18, women would be subjected to similar forms of violence because of how marriage is framed through patriarchal norms. So, yeah, did I answer?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Our last question, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm Aya from the academic program. I have one quick comment and one quick question. The comment is that I am very much attracted to the live study map. I thought that it can also be used for educational purposes, for children to talk about their future as a part of their life planning education. That's one comment. And the question that I have is in terms of the intervention study, I wanted to hear more about how that can be integrated into the existing curriculum.
Into
Existing curriculum.
existing curriculum, okay.
School.
That's a very
Yes,
good
in
question.
school.
Yes, that's a very good question because one of the things that we talk about and we wrote about, I think in one of the papers, we're working on publishing from the intervention study right now. But one of the issues related to Syrian refugee adolescent girls is that they drop out of school before the curriculum on sex education, and I wouldn't even call it sex education in the context of Lebanon. It's more puberty education. Before the girls receive basic information about puberty and very, very little on reproductive health. Refugee girls drop out of school before grade 7, I think, when they receive this information. So that's one strong argument that we presented, that this program is important because it includes girls in school and girls who are not in school. And those who are not in school, they would never get this information. And then they would marry. They would get married and basically would receive information from their mother, from their aunt. And in some qualitative work we did, the mothers said that they don't have the accurate information to relate to their daughters, and they actually want their daughters to get this information scientifically, not to talk about sex, but to, you know, just to show the reproductive system and to give them like a biology lesson. The mothers were all okay with this and happy for an NGO or a research project or a school to provide this information for their daughters. In the prevalence study we did, in fact, a large proportion, again, this is a very particular community. The mother's level of education was very disadvantaged, the profile, and maybe more than 60% of the mothers married before age 18. So there's, you know, it's a community that's been dislocated in Syria long before they became refugees in Lebanon. And this shows in the, you know, in the educational profile and health profile of the women from that community.
Thank you so much, Sawsan. You know, it strikes me as this final word here that what you say is so true for so many of these sensationalized areas. I mean, you know, as you know, I work on trafficking. I would say the same thing, that all this kind of, you know, shock and horror and moral outrage about trafficking, which portrays it as kind of like an evil man intervening, like, you know, early marriage is often an evil parent or an evil community. Actually, these are multifactorial kind of epiphenomena of deprivation. And I think it's so misleading that we often, you know, portray them. And we also in the human rights community for so long have portrayed these phenomena as being, you know, they're bad actors, as opposed to saying there are systemic reasons why families make these choices. So thank you. This was really a wonderful presentation. Good luck with
Thank you so much for
finishing
the
it.
questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,